Advocacy and human rights is ultimately about defending rights, ensuring your voices are heard and respected, increasing confidence and positive outcomes for future. Through this presentation, the objective is to deliver an appreciation of the collaborative, co-productive, inclusive discussions, analysis and work we have done to get to this point, with contributions from David, Fiona, Neil, Ramon, and obviously myself. To achieve a sustainable co-productive partnership contributing to autism and advocacy, supporting inclusion with individualisation and planning, complementing our nation's collective responsibility towards our commitment to the United Nations Autism, Inclusion and Neurodiversity Agenda of 2030, as well as component contributions to the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainability, building on barriers already overcome with partnership action points in collectively taking things forward. This is a simple overview of the objectives of this collective presentation, drawn on community input, including many of the 140 plus local support groups, which are often neglected and ignored. You will hear from David on the broad work of Advocacy Roundtable, importance of autistic input, Ramon on the importance of autistic-informed advocacy and the work of the Roundtable, Fiona on parental advocacy training, and Neil on advocacy and supported decision-making. There is no doubt we are living in complex, challenging times. The lack of political cooperation, the drive for increased political isolationism and separatism, and the impact of SARS-CoV-2, more commonly referred to as COVID-19, being portrayed globally by politicians and the media as a balancing act between public health and economics, which of course it is. We have unheard micromanagement of people's lives with consequences of individualised households, businesses, country and global economic hardships, resulting in an unprecedented borrowing levels for countries, businesses and families. For the majority of us alive today, across much of the modern world, we have never experienced such a centralist control approach. According to what I have learned from my comprehensive set of World War II newspapers, such micromanagement didn't exist during the last World War. My associates from across the globe are very clear who is suffering the worst due to COVID and the emergency measures. Unfortunately, there would appear to be no change in the historic repetitiveness of the impact of political measures impacting most on the disadvantaged, the poor, the disabled, the vulnerable, the weak, the excluded, the mentally ill, irrespective of an individual's and or family's level of severity. Indicatively, if all the media portrayal is correct, we are heading for a global pandemic of poverty, mental health and unemployment, with the risk of substantial and potential sustained reductions to frontline services, fundamentally due to the inconsistencies of national measures and the imbalance of power versus people, economy and service provision. This is applicable to many countries globally, and we here in Scotland and the rest of the UK are not exempt from this. Here in the UK, including Scotland, parts of the emergency legislation has reduced or removed many of the dual safeguards that are applicable to practitioners, individuals and their families alike. Such measures has not proven to have been required thus far, and I am therefore advocating that they be removed from the emergency legislation. Credit, though, where credit is due. Self-directed support legislation has proven substantially beneficial for many autistics and their families. The Scottish Government has even initiated self-directed support flexibility during COVID, but they, nor Self-Directed Support Scotland, nor many of the health and social care partnerships have widely publicised it. A direct contradiction to choice and control and active citizenship. Credit also to health and social care partnerships and their mental health practitioners for the uptake and practice of care programme approach. It isn't perfect, but it's a positive stepping stone to address discharge and avoidance of discharge from hospital and avoidance of compulsory treatment orders. There is most definitely a role for advocacy and the SDQ and DOBA within this approach. Who got information out to service users, not necessarily quickly. From what I hear, not all even now have. I would like to pay particular compliment to Glasgow Autism Resource Centre and AAA in Aberdeen and Autism Network Scotland, All three played an integral part in supporting strategic authorities in formulating information prior to distribution. I would also like to compliment Glasgow City Council and their health and social care partnerships, as they were tactically strategic in the formulation of and accuracy of the information issued in connection with option 1 of self-directed support payments. Spain must also get credit for its regular updates and accuracy of information and their campaigning associated to the accuracy, information and protection and balance of these much needed essential services. Did you know the term autistic was coined nearly in the early 1900s by Eugen Bleuer, a Swiss psychiatrist, to describe the social withdrawal and detachment from reality seen in children with schizophrenia? In 1924, Dr. Gunya Shukareva, a Russian child psychiatrist, saw a boy aged 12. He was caring and attentive. She observed him with a keen eye, noting that he was highly intelligent and liked to engage in philosophical discussions. By way of diagnosis, she described him as an introverted type with an autistic proclivity into himself. That was two decades before Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger published what was long considered to be the first clinical accounts of autism. Despite this, and all that has followed over the last 100 years or so, in our knowledge and understanding of autism, we are as a society still, maybe not entirely in policy, but perhaps unintentionally in practice, in so many ways, exclusionary of autistics. All of what I'm going to talk about in this overview has come out of collaborative, co-productive discussions and analysis from the collective community and their partners. I can say from a parent and advocacy perspective, having advocated for several thousand individuals and their families, when partnership, working, inclusion and co-productivity works at any level, it can work exceptionally well, but it works better when working at all levels. Here we look at two sets of outcomes, those of the autism strategy and of the commissioning strategy. We can identify crossover outcomes between the two, and if we adopt the approach of advocating, mitigating, inclusion, opportunity, accessible via the panel approach of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality, we can achieve positive outcomes. Read the first statement and ask yourself, is such a statement acceptable? Is such a perception within the statement perhaps an illustration as to why most of the 140 plus support groups across Scotland get little to no recognition, let alone an opportunity to have meaningful engagement? A challenge that needs addressed. Advocacy can support this challenge. Even in this day and age, I still hear the question, who has human rights? Everybody has human rights. Even those who have autism and or a learning disability has human rights, including children and young people. Did you know there are 30 basic human rights? They are defined within our internal laws and international treaties. The Scottish Government are currently in the process of incorporating UNCRPD into Scots law. Will this, like aspects of the Children and Young Persons legislation, end up in the Supreme Court? A request to the Children and Young People's Commissioner Service, watch this and keep an eye on it, and please flag up anything that needs changed to the Scottish Government. What have we learned through the process so far? Who do you think the best person people are to be independent advocates are? Autistic individuals, parent carers, and paid advocates. You can see the percentages. 52% said they should all have adequate training. How do you think advocacy services should be delivered? One-to-one or collective? 76% said one-to-one. What training do you think advocacy workers should have? Autism, 37%. Advocacy training, 27%. Legislative training, 13%. Communication training on communication tools, 9%. All of the above, 13%. We also learned from the legislation was inconsistent reprovision and vice versa. We also recognised the gaps in advocacy provisions. What is advocacy and what is not? Let us pause and look at this. And I'll take a couple of minutes, and let you read this slide yourselves. And hopefully you will recognise what is and what isn't advocacy. This comes from the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance, and through our work, there was no disagreement on what is and what isn't. Different types of advocacy. What's needed here is the inclusion of autistic and parental voice in the shaping and actual inclusion in delivery of advocacy services and provision. They can be one-to-one, there can be a collective or group, there can be peer, and obviously there is self. It is important that advocacy is person-centred, focused, and that can also be applicable to collective and peer. And it is important that all advocacy is based with a human rights approach. Advocacy can only have real impact if it has equitable inclusion across legislation. Why? Simply put, our lives do not evolve around one simple piece of legislation. The sample legislation on this slide are ones predominantly used by local authorities to enable issue-based advocacy via their eligibility criteria. There were complex, unresolved discussions around this directly linking to the challenges, given that the local authority determines the issues and the eligibility and which advocacy service they contract. Does that make independent advocacy genuinely independent, or does it merely make it professional as in paid for? Does such commission limit accessibility, predictively code, albeit unintentional, any potential outcomes, particularly given the apparent lack of knowledge of autism that many professional advocacy practitioners have? I personally posed this thought. It did not come from the work. I have no doubt many skill sets are genuinely and practically transferable from condition to condition, as well as person to person. But this is, I think, a direct parallel. Most positive behavioural support training is dependent on the trainee having sufficient knowledge of the individual's condition and communication methods to enable PBS to be effective. Does the same principles and objectives apply to advocacy? We should be addressing this via the inclusion of autism-informed advocacy, both in terms of peer advocacy and professional advocacy where appropriate. It was recognised through our work that there were distinct gaps in access and provisions for autistics and their parent carers, both advocacy and advice. We should perhaps be incorporating enhanced partnership working and training to address these gaps. The list on the left of this screen shows where many of the gaps are. Key considerations that were identified through discussions that may impact on an autistic individual and their ability to process that require appreciation for any practitioner, as well as the importance of communicative, inclusive, supportive decision making. I'll give you a second to read down this slide and appreciate the points that we're making. The Autism Advocacy Report went to the Scottish Strategy for Autism Review Group that resulted in the Autism Advocacy Collaborative, which led to the various pieces of work we are now handling. I am now handing over to David, Ramon, Fiona and Neil, who are each going to give you an overview contribution of some of that work.
My name is Fiona Millen. I have spent the past 20 years advocating for my son who has autism. This has been a very challenging journey with heartbreak, tears and sadness along the way. It has been a constant battle to access services and support that are person-centred to my son to enable him to live a happy, healthy, inclusive life. I felt very privileged to be part of the Parental Advocacy Training Pilot delivered at the Paisley Carer Centre. I have gained invaluable knowledge and learned to get out of fight mode, stay calm, and work in partnership to get the best outcome for my son. The Parental Advocacy Training pilot was delivered at the Paisley Carer Centre. This was warmly welcomed by the parents who attended. This course is being developed to both enhance parent skills and enable them to advocate with more informed knowledge and skills in a stronger person-centred focus to benefit the individuals they care for. Hopefully, the course will be delivered in a skilled or enhanced level that can potentially be rolled across Scotland. The parents were able to tell us about their experiences, and sadly many of them were very negative. Every one of them wanted to make their situation better for their loved ones. The course content was broad and informative. We covered outline legislation, roles and responsibilities. We created a scenario and then worked our way through the scenario. What impact has the training had on parents? They gain knowledge and understanding. They have enhanced their skill set. They have learned about advocating with a person-centred focus. After just a few weeks, the parents fed back that they were having very positive experiences and they could see huge benefits from the training already. They felt empowered and more confident. They felt valued and listened to. Here are some of the statements from parents. I used to dread attending additional support for learning meetings at the school. I have learned to go in with a very different approach, and I now actually feel as though they listen to me and I feel valued. Another parent offered strategies to the school. She felt listened to and the communication improved between schools and the home. The school fed back to Mum that the strategies were working well for the child. One parent now had the confidence to ask to work in partnership with the school and asked about transition planning for high school. Another parent shared how difficult and lonely her journey had been with a constant battle for support up until now. Now she felt informed and was enjoying finding out what support was out there. She was also improving her own abilities in advocating for her loved one. And finally, one of the group had not heard about self-directed support before starting the training. 4 weeks later, she had a very positive meeting and actually felt more informed about self-directed support than the social worker. She had grown in confidence and got a person-centred package for her loved one. This parent also said the facilitator was excellent, and what a difference being taught by someone who had lived experience. He just got it. It has given me new skills and confidence and realised just how important partnership working is to get the best possible outcome for my loved one. And also, no one person has all the answers. I am looking forward to using my new skills that I have learned to advocate both for my son and for the group of young adults who attend the Renfrewshire Autism Project, where I am the project manager. Finally, what would have made the course better? Possibly the participation from inclusion managers and frontline practitioners, as this training was ultimately about working together. Thank you.
As an autistic person, I was diagnosed approximately 20 years ago, and trying to bring my perspective and knowledge to the Autism and Advocacy Roundtable was a lot of it was about service access and utility on the ground, in particular outside of the central belt. Having used various forms of advocacy, including currently an independent advocate. The advocacy was provided by East Ayrshire Advocacy Services, which is an SIA member, SIAA member, I should say. Has proven to be a massive boon to me in my current ongoing situation, dealing with the local authorities, social work department, and with the DWP. It's a situation where I had an advocate use support, used as support for SDS, self-directed support, sort of as a witness for any interactions I had with the local authority. As much for my sake to remind me of what I was doing, and also to provide that kind of buffer against any issues that I had with them, or them not necessarily fulfilling the word of what I said. I also learned that there are a number of issues with the absolutely rigid form of advocacy, particularly where this involved a need for significant advice at the same time. There were clear limitations on what advocacy could be, and bringing that to the roundtable was particularly important to me. A lot of the organisations that people are using, like the one-stop shops, as substitutes for what would be independent advocacy, don't quite meet the standards, but they're the best option that people often have, which creates a bit of tension as to what independent advocacy could represent. Those would be obviously where the optimal solutions for people with autism don't involve large numbers of professionals, or where there's significant amounts of change in who those professionals happen to be. And if you deal with a local authority, quite often you could be dealing with in the lifetime of someone with autism, maybe even a dozen social workers, different education professionals. It can get quite difficult at the best of times. So having one consistent person to go to for support, particularly in advocacy, is a big deal for a lot of autistic people. There was overall at the roundtable, there was definitely a broad range of opinions, perspectives, which wasn't. It was definitely trying at times, because everybody was bringing their own perspective to the group and trying to plug in their perspective as best they could. But overall, I would say we did a fantastic job. There was a lot of opportunity for me to certainly plug in my perspective as best as possible, about the balance of services, and a multidisciplinary approach outside of just advocacy itself, and the need for that. I wanted to highlight that across Ayrshire, more than anything else, I think that there was a limited access to independent advocacy provision in general. The majority of the population, there's only really one or two options for independent advocacy, which means that a lot of people are having to go to the one-stop shop. That is their only real option, or other third-party providers of support for people with autism, including the National Autistic Society. But the options are extremely limited in areas like Ayrshire, and that certainly was highlighted by other members of the group, that depending on where you were in the country could depend massively on how reasonable it was to assume that you could get access to any advocacy services at all, never mind ones that are autism informed and completely and adequately independent. And unfortunately, that isn't always the case for people. It isn't always reasonable to assume that they could get that. But everyone around the table we almost came to a unilateral agreement that there was a need for independent autism informed advocacy provision in Scotland. The number one kind of element I sort of hit was that more complex needs for the majority of autistic people, not just the people with learning disabilities, had to be met. People living on their own, people at uni, unfortunately that's a really underrepresented demographic, and that was kind of highlighted as a concern. The other one was sort of emphasising the value of a unitary approach, particularly the one-stop shops, because I'm something of a fan of the model. The concept, it could be, hasn't always been implemented particularly well, but I'm definitely a fan of the model. The concept is 100% sound. Unfortunately, that also means that there has to be a kind of a point where we take autistic people's kind of voice into account. For one of the obvious standout points is the number of people that we're actually having to interact with. It isn't ideal to have six professionals to deal with one problem. Going into a situation where you need an advocate, someone to advocate for you, but that's one more person when you're often dealing with another six. So if you go into a situation where hypothetically you're with a social worker, sometimes someone else from their department, an advocate, and you also needed some form of advice. In some cases that might often be a meeting with a lawyer, two social workers, their team head, and an advocate. That's a lot of people, and it's not economical or efficient, and it's just more stress for the autistic person. The service user can't really say what they need to say in a situation where they're closed in by too many professionals. And it was kind of, or at least I personally tried to highlight that often in situations where advocacy is needed, there's also a concurrent requirement for significant legal advice, or often other advice that the social workers or whoever it is, whatever service you're trying to access, isn't providing at that time. And it may not necessarily be information they have to provide. So you often need, it's often the need for advocacy is often concurrent with the need for advice in those meetings at that time. And being able to rely on someone for more than what advocacy sometimes can, within its very strict format, provide. So with that in mind, I'd try to emphasise that there's there should perhaps be a broader, more flexible kind of outlook on what advocacy could be at its best, and understanding the limits for service users with regards to a pure advocacy service. a pure independent advocacy service on its own may not necessarily fulfil the ultimate needs of service users. But despite that raising a number of largely philosophical discussions between various members of the groups and what they brought to the table, we did largely come to an understanding about what that would entail and the need for, as I said earlier, independent advocacy services that were autism informed and could provide service users with all the information they needed and all the support they needed in the meetings, in the room with them, with the professionals, rather than what often happens, you end up in something by yourself, with no information, no way to know what you're entitled to, what your rights are, what your position should even be, and no one to support you to do that. And that's particularly true for people, as I said before, again, at university, or that have moved out of their parents' home, or essentially anyone without a learning disability probably won't have significant support from their family as an adult at that point, at least not for day-to-day things, and that's a serious complication for a lot of autistic people in Scotland who don't have access to certain services afforded people with learning disabilities. All in, everyone at the table was on the same page. We all want to see advocacy services available to people when and where they need them, and that those services be appropriate, giving autistic people a voice, and hopefully highlighting throughout the work of the roundtable, hopefully highlighting the need for service provision itself, where it isn't as robust like in Ayrshire, where we have maybe one or two independent advocacy providers. We definitely want to highlight that there is a need, and we need more information about where to plug services in to try and provide a service for those service users that don't have necessarily a robust access to advocacy provision in certain areas of Scotland.
Hello, and welcome to my talk about supported decision making and its role in advocacy for autistic individuals. Supported decision making seeks to replace rather than run in parallel to historical mental health law. This is a unique and progressive development which seeks to address the discrimination of separate mental health law by stating that individuals are not to be treated as unable to make a decision unless all practical help and support to enable the person to make a decision about the matter have been given without success. So what exactly is supported decision making? Well, supported decision making is a framework within which a person with a disability can be assisted to make valid decisions. It can take many forms. However, the key tenet is the advocate may help others to realize that disabled individuals have interests and aims in life and are incapable of exercising their own legal capacity. What's important to note, though, is that it is the way in which these preferences are interpreted and implemented that matters, rather than an assumption of the capacity of the individual. And as such, Professor Dandra suggested that supported decision-making would be better conceived as a universal component of community life for all citizens, rather than something targeting only those with a disability. So why supported decision-making? Well, the need for supported decision-making comes from the whole of Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which represents a paradigm shift away from substitute decision-making to a raft of supports enabling greater self-determination. This benefits individuals by increasing citizenship, increasing personal empowerment, developing self-determination, improving self-esteem, and developing decision-making skills. Societies can also benefit as well, as it contributes to a better and wider understanding of the importance of respecting the rights of all citizens and a more inclusive approach to disability policy and support. So we'll look briefly now at supported decision-making within the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As we said before, the Convention shifts dramatically from the traditional approach where a person may be deemed incapable based solely on the fact they have an impairment, towards a functional test by which a person is considered incapable if, by reason of the disability, he or she is unable to perform a specific task. And the Convention requires state parties to create appropriate and effective safeguards for the exercise of legal capacity using the best interpretation of will and preferences rather than the best interests principle. Now, there's a slight distinction here, and what that is current legislation says that if opinion contradicts best interests overrule, whereas what they're saying now is that we should be looking to say opinion, if we can get a good interpretation of that, should overrule best. So, in 2017, the United Kingdom underwent an examination by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities regarding their compliance with the CRDP. They said the UK should abolish all forms of substitute decision-making and introduce new legislation pertaining to mental capacity and mental health that is in line with the CRPD. These findings are an important recognition of the value placed on supported decision-making and legal capacity in realising the full implementation on the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So, what models or approaches to supported decision-making are there? There are four main ones we want to talk about, the first being the adapted stepped model. Now, the adapted stepped model was based on the stepped model proposed by Brayley at the World Congress of Adult Guardianship in October 2012 in Melbourne. This model has three distinct features. Firstly, it's relationship-driven support in which the individual remains in control at all times. It makes a distinction between assistance and support, and it allows for external monitoring of the relationship and support to ensure that no forms of abuse by advocates to the individuals they support is possible. The second model is Bach and Kernzer's model. They state that there are three main types of support in exercising supported decision-making. Firstly, supports to explore choice and come to a decision. Second, to engage with others in decision-making and come to an agreement. And third, support to enact a decision once it has been made. So you're seeing there a continuum of moving along a continuum of support. They also argue that legal capacity is exercised in different ways depending on an individual's capacity. And they acknowledge the relationship between decision-making abilities, supports, and accommodations, and recognition of status that enables people to move along this continuum of support. The Flynn and Artson-Kerzler-Lakes model suggests that the enabling conditions for effective supported decision-making to take place must be provided at all times, even if these do not result in a perceptible increase in decision-making capability for the individual concerned, stating that the presence of enabling conditions can allow an individual to move along the continuum of support. They recognise enabling conditions as including advocacy, reasonable adjustments and/or accommodations, accessible information and communication, recognition of different forms of expression, and advanced planning tools. The final model to look at is the legal mentor model, which provides an alternative to guardianship and is most notably used in Sweden. It allows for a mentor appointed through local court proceedings with the consent of the individual to be supported to act on behalf of said individual for as long as said individual deems the mentorship to be beneficial. and the mentor can be anyone that the individual trusts. It does not have to be a professional or a legally qualified person. The benefits of this model is that the procedure is swift, it takes approximately 3 weeks, and there are no application or court fees. The model enables the mentor to represent the individual in applying for services and/or financial support, as well as legal matters, without compromising their legal capacity. Another way to say that is so that there is no requirement to have any form of a power of attorney. So what are the challenges that we face in implementing social supported decision making? Well, the root of the problem of implementing supported decision making is that it is conceptually ill-defined, leaving it open to multiple interpretations. And a lot of people argue that the CRPD's introduction of supported decision making has largely become a case of much talk and little real action, while Arnstein-Kerslake raises concerns that supported decision making could become another bureaucratic tick box exercise. And the concern there is that there's not enough guidance within the convention to actually suggest how we should implement this supported decision making. Therefore, what requires to be done is a code of practice guidance is crucial and critical in helping to develop the ways in which legislation is actioned, and supporting decision-making initiatives should be explicitly linked to the legal framework. There are also some other issues that are actually structural or nation-state-wide barriers to implementation. And these include slow progress on legislative reform, high cost of implementation, the need for staff training, inconsistent practices across individual organisations and across neighbouring counties or countries, concerns regarding safeguarding, and a lack of involvement by interested parties. Currently, there are not enough disabled people who are actually involved in the policy-making process. According to People First, people with learning disabilities have also identified the following challenges. Adults with learning disabilities are often viewed as children. A power imbalance exists between the advocate and the individual. Confusion over differences between mental disorder and learning disability by advocates, and the need to balance protection against autonomy and risk-taking and individual choice, and a failure to consider that different decisions may require different levels of support. So, how have people actually experienced supported decision-making? One of the key findings has been that decision-making is a dynamic and interactional process. Indeed, Knight et al. Posited that there were 4 main types of narrative positioning for an advocate: the inward expert, the outward entruster, the self-aware observer, and the social integrator, which may overlap and change. This range of positions emphasizes the importance of trying to understand the subjective perspective of the person about the help they need. Overall, very positive practice was reported, especially for everyday decision-making. However, difficult decisions were less well supported. Most intellectually disabled individuals reported being able to make some medical decisions, but often took a supporter with them to appointments to help them in difficult interactions. However, there are concerns the best interest principle is still used rather than this best interpretation of will. Care professionals also reported medical decisions often being made using the best interests framework under the Mental Capacity Act rather than the best interpretation of will's principle following multidisciplinary meetings. Overall, one can argue that effective supported decision-making processes tend to include a commitment to the individual, including knowing the person well and respecting wishes for discretion or the involvement of additional parties, following support principles, including communicating in an open and non-challenging way, providing clear information in different formats, clarity regarding the roles of the involved parties, and adherence to relevant legislation and knowledge of a selection of flexible and adaptable strategies. There are many benefits of supported decision-making, including increased personal autonomy and control, a clearer structure within families, professional relationships in making decisions and plans, and ensuring legal capacity to make decisions is respected. So have we had any examples of good practice? Well, absolutely yes. For example, building supported decision-making knowledge, skills of family members and friends, offering peer mentoring workshops for both supporters and people receiving support, ensuring that supported decision-making is culturally sensitive, delivering supported decision-making in partnership with independent advocacy services, and maintaining records of the steps taken in the supporting decision-making process in order that other people can learn from where we've fallen down and where we've been beneficial. So, in conclusion then, it can be research in mental health services has also found that when people feel they are listened to, even if they disagree with the outcome, they are less likely to feel dissatisfied with the service provided. So it can therefore be concluded that supported decision-making can have wider societal benefits through ensuring participation and recognition of citizenship rights, developing a more inclusive approach to the realization of disability rights, and developing a framework in which individuals are empowered to gain more control over their lives. Therefore, we can see that advocates and advocacy services, in their many differentially defined way, play a key role in campaigning for greater supported decision-making, better policy in implementing supported decision-making, and better advocate training to ensure that individuals' lives are improved by the people who advocate for them.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the invitation to talk to this year's Autism Network Annual Conference. My name's Ramon Hutchinson. I'm the coordinator of the Autism Resources Coordination Hub, ARCH, South Lanarkshire. And I have been a member of the collaborative, the advocacy collaborative within Autism Network Scotland for the past year or so. And this presentation will be essentially about my experiences within the collaborative and specifically about the development of a peer advocacy service. So let's begin. I've started with a quote which I think kind of sums everything up. It's about inclusion is not bringing people into what already exists. It's about making a new space, a better space for everyone. And when we set about the task of actually kind of doing this matter of peer advocacy or advocacy in general, it was about thinking about how to augment or even supplement existing professional advocacy services, because the reality on the ground in South Lanarkshire, and I'm sure in several other authorities, is that there was a general absence of professional independent advocacy services, and this was a way that we felt might be able to augment that, to supplement it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the challenges and the opportunities, and this was about establishing the roundtable discussions. And the first thing we had to do was obviously identify autism partners and stakeholders, which obviously first and foremost included the Scottish Independence Advocacy Alliance, and thereafter, several third sector partners, advocacy projects in various authorities, and it really was about making sure that, as well as identifying stakeholders, professional organisations, it was also about ensuring that the autistic voice was represented, and we had 4 autistic adults who basically were making contributions in the roundtable discussions, some of whom I believe you may be hearing from today. So we went about deliberating what we tried to endeavour to become a shared vision of what is and what is not independent professional advocacy, and what is and what is not peer-led advocacy services. So there was an obvious difference there, and it was about arriving at a joint statement where all stakeholders' viewpoints would be respected and acknowledged, and that wasn't without its tensions. It wasn't without its challenges. But what it was also about was recognising that there were gaps in autism-informed advocacy provision, and the perceptions of the autism community itself. And those perceptions had been very well articulated at the consultation exercise in 2018 when the Scottish Strategy for Autism was reviewed. So there was a very strong message that came across from those consultation exercises, that listening exercise, that the autism community, the autistic community itself, had a perception that autism-informed advocacy services were perhaps not as fulsome as they should be on the ground. So we went about trying to seek some common ground where there was obvious gaps or perceived gaps, but it was also about preserving the professional advocacy services and being able to respect the fact that those services have and continue to offer an excellent service. So we in South Lanarkshire were asked by Autism Network Scotland to undertake, I suppose, a thin slice to kind of really just explore what the community's views were. And I've got to say, in January 2020, we undertook a very quick survey. And to our surprise, we got over 150 respondents, albeit it was only done within, I think, about a 10-day period, a window where we wanted to try and get the views of the community. But our community in South Lanarkshire, I think it's safe to say, is very active and very vocal, very proactive. So we took this thin slice, and I think what we found echoed the messages that had come forth in other, or if you forgive the pun, it was come forth in Forth Valley Advocacy Services for one, in Leeds, Scotland, and Autism Network Scotland's consultation and engagement exercise that had been commissioned by the Scottish Government in their Outcomes and Priorities document. And that was specifically outcome 2 in relation to the provision of choice, a breadth of autism-informed services. So what we tried to do was ask our autistic and autism community to inform the advocacy roundtable discussions. And we found our findings were quite clear in that we identified clear gaps in locality-based autism-informed advocacy services, with 71% of respondents saying quite clearly that they wouldn't know of any organisations offering autism-informed advocacy services within South Lanarkshire. And of course, 87% of those respondents also, if you forgive me just for a wee bit behind the slides, 87% of respondents had never read any autism-informed advocacy publicity material. So they wouldn't know where to source that, and they had never read anything autism-specific, autism-informed advocacy publicity material. And quite significantly, the most powerful outcome of our survey was that the South Lanarkshire autism community overwhelmingly expressed the view that the provision of advocacy services should be through what we called a mixed economy, incorporating independent professional advocacy services and also suitably trained and regulated volunteers from the community, parent carers, autistic people themselves, with relevant training. So that's what we basically kind of fed that information back to the roundtable discussions. So this Busting the Silos title here is obviously relating to the findings, or one of the 4 pillars of the Christie Commission in 2011, which was about trying to bust out or move across or cross-pollinate from organisations who, many of whom have excellent practices and autism-informed awareness, but who don't really can exchange that information with other organisations. So there's kind of very much this, I suppose, to use a term that's used often in autism, monotropic kind of view, where it's kind of tunnel vision and we don't see what's going on around us, the big picture. So it's about busting from those silos and establishing common ground, whilst also recognising the need to have quality assurance and accountability. We felt it was also about establishing clear distinctions between what actually constitutes advocacy, who owns the term advocacy. For example, there is peer advocacy, there is self-advocacy, there is professional independent advocacy, and there's actually group advocacy as well. There are many different forms and iterations of advocacy itself. And we arrived at the conclusion that not one organisation or stakeholder owned those terms. They were about sharing those terms, depending on need. We also felt it was respecting the need for all forms of that, all iterations of advocacy, ensuring that first and foremost, the autism community has informed choice, supported decision making where that's required, and autonomy. So I've mentioned that this contentious issue of the ownership of the term advocacy and who it belongs to was it took up a lot of time. It took up a lot of discussion, and I think that the willingness of the Roundtable group was almost palpable in trying to kind of find a way through that. Another thing that we encountered was that the strengths and the limitations of what we felt could augment the professional independent advocacy, which was peer-led advocacy or community-led advocacy. The strengths were obviously about availability, because that was an issue. It's about the flexibility of locality-informed services that know local policies and procedures, local strategies, local organisations, and the lived experience of people living within those localities, which are often very different. And although we live in one country, I think we would all agree that there are distinct cultural differences between authorities and sometimes within authorities as well. So it was about recognising that and understanding that actually is a strength. Some of the limitations, however, were obviously about the potentially subjective interactions or interventions, about the fact that, as it stands, peer-led advocacy is, could be considered unaccountable. Many could be considered unaware of statutory or professional constraints, with little ethical benchmarks or limitations relating to supported decision making. So there were those dilemmas that were rightfully floated within the group, the roundtable discussion, the collaborative, and some of the concerns about that, which I think we all shared and were anxious, keen to make sure that if we do have a continuum of advocacy services, that those services are accountable and do have adequate training, and are accountable, and they have a degree of objectivity where that's required, but also I think acknowledging that within the autism community, sometimes independent professional advocacy is maybe not required at the stage at which that kind of representation is needed, and that sometimes peer advocacy can be much more effective and much more responsive. So it was to create our objective was to create this continuum of service provision, but it was also about defining the limits and the thresholds within each, and making sure that where there was peer advocacy or community-led advocacy, that it was not purporting to be professional, independent advocacy. It was distinctly different from those services, but it was also had its place in that continuum of services. So that's what we finally, I think, through much deliberation and some agonising, arrived at. So we arrived finally at this definition, and after much discussion and deliberation, as the slide says, the Roundtable Forum agreed that Scotland will have access to a range of independent and autism-informed advocacy delivered at the right time, in the right way, appropriate to need, and delivered by the right people. And that kind of really sums up what we kind of arrived at in terms of the roundtable discussions. I've already mentioned it was very much a kind of agonising discussion at times, and there were some very heated exchanges with some very considered views being exchanged. But the reality is that the autism community has spoken, has made its views very clear through numerous consultation and engagement exercises, and we need to listen. And I'll sum up with a quote that I think is quite relevant. And it says, "The world is full of willing people, some willing to undertake the hard and arduous work that's required, and others willing to let them. So I would ask delegates to roll up their sleeves and let's get this achieved. Let's get this vision and this definition a reality in Scotland." And thank you very much for your attention. And that's the presentation over.
Thank you to David, Ramon, Fiona and Neil for their contributions. In addition, we recognise the benefits and suggest, what if we had access to an accurate proficient assessment tool developed in the UK by child and psychiatric professionals, used in 29 countries and recognised by the British Association of Social Work. We're doing a short overview piece on this as well. You will see listed some of the events, reports, seminars directly associated to autism in recent years. These are on top of this, some cross-government reviews and reports, as well as a list of approved smaller projects that came directly from the Autism Strategy implementation work via Autism Network Scotland. The majority produced recommendations and/or actions. Many of those actions and recommendations do not need government legislation. Local authorities, health and social care partnerships, third sector organisations can and should implement many of those actions and recommendations without the requirement of Scottish Government approval, enabling better, much approved services. A collective partnerships approach to addressing recommendations from reviews and meeting need, moving away from control and compliance to supporting improved health, active citizenship, choice and control, and greater individualised independence. We should move forward and address the following in the last 13 months of this strategy. Recognise the autistic and parental voices, implement the recognitions of the mental health, implement the recommendations of the mental health review in the autism and learning disabilities into law, implement the recommendations of the additional support for learning review, implement the recommendations of not included, not involved, not engaged, identify and implement improvements to self-directed support to enable choice and control right across all of Scotland, particularly during COVID and the flexibility of self-directed support. Incorporate the SDQ and DOBA, moving the focus to early identification for earlier supports, driving the 3 autism modules using the postgraduate diploma in education to all existing teachers and social work that is delivered within the University of Strathclyde via ANS, deliver the parental advocacy training across the country, develop autism-informed advocacy policy and practice, improve cross-practice and cross-policy cohesion. All the above would enhance inclusion, opportunity, contribute to employment and enterprise, and support individual and family resilience. Extend the autism strategy for 2 years to enable introduction of autism legislation that does more than England's Autism Act or the US Autism Cares Act. Caveat here being balance, about improving statutory provision, but avoiding adding to additional bureaucratic workload. All these things will also add component contributions towards the UN Autism, Inclusion and Neurodiversity Agenda and also the UN Agenda on Sustainability. After much discussion and deliberation, the Advocacy Roundtable Forum arrived at this definition. Scotland will have access to a range of independent and autism-informed advocacy delivered at the right time, in the right way, appropriate to need, and delivered by the right people. Work by the Challenging Behaviour Foundation in 2016 suggests that good advocacy can both improve safeguarding of vulnerable people and reduce costs to social services. On behalf of David, Ramon, Fiona, Neil and myself, thank you for viewing this component to the Scottish Strategy for Autism virtual conference. Thank you.